Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I didn't do a Friday Reads this week, so I thought I would just pop in here and do a Sunday Reads. And it's actually kind of fitting because although I am going into work tomorrow on Monday, on Tuesday I start a week of vacation. So it is sort of like I'm going into a weekend of sorts with my reading. So in terms of what I read last week, you might recall from one of my book hauls recently, I had picked up a book that was unknown to me called The Little Minister, and I noticed on the side that the author is Barry. And it wasn't until I opened it up to actually read it that the little bell went off in my head, and I said, oh my god, I'm an idiot. The author here is J.M. Barrie. Yes, that's the same author as Peter Pan, and this is one of his adult novels. And it's an interesting one. It was actually quite entertaining. Not what you would expect if you had read Peter Pan. This edition is from the 1890s, and I paid $15 for it secondhand. But basically the story here is about a young minister by the name of Gavin, and he's very young. He's about 21 when he gets his first, I guess you would call it a parish. He gets his first parish and he moves with his mother to this town. He is unmarried, but we get the story from the perspective of this narrator who's not really telling us a whole lot about who he is until the end of the novel, and we discover why he is doing his best not to be seen or known by the mother of this young minister. And they call him the Little Minister because he is quite short actually, and he's young, but he comes and has quite a good reputation with the people in his parish. And of course all the women of marriageable age are sort of setting their cap for him because everyone wants to be the minister's wife. And of course, although he doesn't get a large salary, it is a salary that's larger than what some of these impoverished people in the area make. There is some sort of political tension. We get insurrections, so to speak. Shortly after he arrives, there is an incident where soldiers, the British military, I guess, march on the town and arrest a bunch of the men for some of their activities. And in the midst of this gypsy woman shows up, dressed in a different way and talking in a different way, to the point that people are a little bit scandalized, and she actually, calls for the townspeople to attack these soldiers and fight, and the minister is just horrified, and he calls her out and eventually preaches a couple of sermons about her because she really gets under his skin. And of course there's more there than his anger than meets the eye. This is a romance novel, but she is not who she appears to be. And so things escalate from there, and it was quite entertaining. If you come across a copy, I would definitely recommend it. So I read that. And then on a whim, I went to my bookshelf and I picked up a book that had been sitting on it for 3 or 4 years. I've had this since before I moved to Ottawa. I think I purchased this the summer before I moved out here. And this is The Razor's Edge by Somerset Maugham, I think. Just dawned on me that I've never had to pronounce that name. But I had purchased this originally because years ago when I was a teenager, watching late night TV, I caught the tail end of a movie, and it was the movie adaptation of this book. And at the time it fascinated me because it is about a man of, I guess I would describe it, sufficient means. He has enough that he could live semi-comfortably for the rest of his life, in what we would describe as semi-comfortably, but of course he's an orphan. And of course his guardian and his friends around him and his fiancée are quite wealthy, and so they want him to build a career so that he can live the same lifestyle they're used to. But he's been in the war, and now that he's back from the war, something happened over there. It's never fully explained, but he saw someone that he was close to die, and so it changed his entire perspective and philosophy about life. And so he goes on what the narrator describes as a spiritual journey to learn and to discover. He spurns the idea of college. He goes off to Paris, leaving his fiancée, saying, I'm going off, I'm going to discover basically the meaning of life, why things are the way they are. She doesn't understand, but she says, okay, you've got 2 years, and then at the end of those 2 years, if you haven't found what you're looking for, you'll come back and we'll get married. And, well, of course, he doesn't come back. He is traveling the world from Paris to India, working in coal mines and so on and so forth, and bumming passage on boats for his labor. And it's very confusing to his wealthy friends, but our narrator, who is a writer who kind of pops in and out of the lives of some of the characters in this novel, seems to understand. And it is very much an interesting novel, and I think something that is often recommended to people who are trying to discover their place in life, if only because this character is trying to discover his place in life. And I greatly enjoyed it. I'm glad I finally read it. Then I ended up picking, I'm not finished this one yet, I've read about 100 pages, and it's The Voyage of the Beagle by Darwin. I've got it in this hardback that I picked up secondhand a while back, the Harvard Classics, the 5-foot shelf of books edition. And so it's pretty interesting so far. It's not something you'd read in one long binge, because it is really a travel diary, and it's very dense. And I saw this creature here, and it had this and this, and it was beside this plant, and then this other animal did this. It's that sort of thing. We came to the shore of here, and I saw this, and I went to here, and I saw that. It's interesting, but it's not something that you would binge read. So I'll continue on with that. Now I've come to what I think was the most interesting and the most gut-wrenching and horrifying book of the last week. And I've got the dust jacket off here because it was a library discard. I'll just reach over here and grab it to show you. But it's a book that was published in the 1980s here in Canada, and it's called In Enemy Hands, Canadian Prisoners of War, 1939 to 1944, by Daniel G. Dancox. Now, if you're an international viewer, you may not know that when Britain declared war on Germany, Canada waited 10 days before also declaring war, and that 10 days was largely symbolic, sort of to signify that even though we are following the mother country into battle, so to speak, it's not because we have to, it's because we've decided to. We are an independent nation, and so we wait a few days. But because Canada joined the war so early on, about 2 years before the United States did, you had prisoners of war who spent 4 or 5 years in German prison camps, and eventually in Japanese prison camps as well, because we were in the war in the Pacific as well. And so this book is essentially anecdotes or stories. As you can see here, this is what the layout would look like. Stories from real POWs about their time spent in these prison camps. The first prisoners would have been pilots in the RCAF, the Royal Canadian Air Force. It's interesting though, because some Canadians joined up with the Canadian military, and other Canadians went to the UK and joined up with the British version. So you had Canadians in essentially two armies, and at some points they actually switched over. So for instance, there's one anecdote here about these Canadians who had joined up with the British Army, and when they escaped from the prisoner of war camp and made it back to England, they were told, okay, you've got 2 weeks off after, being prisoners for a couple of years. You've got 2 weeks off, and then we're going to send you to the Pacific. Or we'll transfer you over to the Canadian Army, and they're going to send you back to Canada. And so these two guys said, you know what, we're switching over to the Canadian Army, and we are getting on the boat back to Canada because we have been prisoners for so long. So you've got interesting things like that, but some of the stuff is just horrifying. For instance, there were some Canadians who, near the end of the war, somehow found themselves not in a normal POW camp where the conditions were better, but they were put into a concentration camp. And they were there for about 2 months, and even after they were released and sent to a proper prisoner of war camp where they should have been, according to the Geneva Convention, their own officers wouldn't believe them about where they'd been and what they'd seen. They were told, that those places don't exist, that's not happening. So there was a lot of denial there. But there's also some very fun stories in here, and maybe I shouldn't say fun, but some very interesting stories. Anecdotes from the Pacific where, for instance, this one guy says, yeah, you could make an orange last 2 weeks. And the idea was that the vitamins in there, like the vitamin C, you needed that consistently because your body needed a steady dose of it and it wouldn't store that up. So if you ate the orange all at once, you'd only get it for that minimum period of time, and the excess vitamins, you'd essentially pee them out. But if you ate one segment a day and then dried out the rind and grated that rind over your ration of rice for the day, then the idea is that you would get a more consistent dose of that vitamin C and whatnot, which I thought was interesting, but on the other hand, absolutely horrifying that you would literally be starving to death and so vitamin deficient that you would even think of doing that. Some anecdotes from the European theater too. Apparently the Canadian Red Cross packages were better than the British ones. The Canadian Red Cross packages had the real butter. The British Red Cross packages had the margarine. And of course these packages, they were meant to go to the prisoners of war. They were meant to get one a week per man. But the way it worked out because of supply chains and withholding these, some of these stories are saying, yeah, the Red Cross packages would arrive maybe once a month, every 4 to 6 weeks, and you'd share it with, 4 to 8 guys. And of course the rations weren't sufficient, so these Canadian prisoners were losing excessive amounts of weight, coming out of them as, 95 pounds, which is absolutely horrific. But I think the most interesting part for me here was there's an entire section on escape plans, and they talk here about The Great Escape, which of course was made into a movie in the 1960s with Steve McQueen, and it's very Americanized in that movie. And Steve McQueen is an American, James Garner is an American, and you've got a whole bunch of Americans, but I'm reading this book, and they said, yeah, there were actually no Americans involved with that escape. If you don't know the story, basically they dug a tunnel, 3 tunnels, but one made it through. They dug a tunnel from the barracks down underneath, shored everything up. They even had electric lights in this tunnel to help them see, and they dug outside the fence. And I believe it was 76 POWs escaped before they were discovered, but most of them were caught within a day or two, and unfortunately the 50 that were caught were taken and executed. And I found out in this book that 6 of those POWs who were executed were in fact Canadians. Of those 76 who escaped, 3 actually made it back to Allied lines, back to Britain, and the remainder were sent back to camps. But it was interesting for me to read this from the perspective of some Canadians who remembered being there. So this was kind of a gem to finally pick up and read. I think I'd had it on my shelf for about a year, perhaps more. So that was a good read, but a difficult one to read just because of the horrific things that those men went through. And, you know, it didn't even end there. There was one story in there about a man who had been a prisoner of war for, I think, 3 or 4 years, constantly thinking about his wife, going home to her, and after he finally got home to Canada, she died 11 days later of cancer. So you can only imagine the sort of things that generation would have gone through. So after I finished that, I decided I was going to read my first Gore Vidal novel. So I picked up The Judgment of Paris, and I'm going to be honest, I'm slightly less than halfway through, but I think I might end up DNFing this one. It is not a writing style that I enjoy. So the narrator or the author or whatever seems to be involved in the story and is telling us at times what to think, but then we get our main character, the American in Rome. I'm forgetting his name, it's that memorable to me. Philip. Philip is taking a year in post-war Europe to explore how he shall play out his future. Philip is a very dislikable character. I'm not sure what he's up to, whether he's telling us the truth. He very much seems to be pushed along by events. There's this weird thing going on with this secret society of royalists who want to bring someone back to the throne, and they entrust him with this secret document, and even though he's warned by some other Americans, a woman he's having an affair with, not to get involved with them because it could be dangerous, he does it anyway, doesn't really explain why, and it's just kind of an uninteresting read. Despite all the things that are happening, it's uninteresting because I feel so far removed from the characters, and none of the characters really seem worth reading about. So we'll see what I decide to do with this one. So let me know what you are reading in the comments, and I hope that you've had a lovely weekend so far.